As we continue our survey of classical rhetoric with a view to equipping ourselves to analyze the persuasive strategy of particular New Testament texts, we move to even more specific topics that could be used as the basis for appeals to logos in these speeches, in these pieces of communication that sought to persuade. A number of common topics that appear in deductive proofs would be those listed here. These are called common topics, not because they show up all the time, they're common, but because they're common to the different genres of oratory. You can find these kinds of argument in deliberative, judicial, even epideictic speeches. A common strategy, this time common in the sense of appears all the time, is the argument from the lesser to the greater, or from the greater to the lesser, where the speaker argues that if such holds in a less important case, it must hold all the more in a more important case, or the reverse. We have a number of such arguments in Hebrews itself. Notably in 2:1-4, the author argues that if God enforced the covenant that was communicated through angels, the lesser case, how much more will God enforce the covenant communicated through the Son, who is of more value, of greater honor than the angels? It was also typical to create arguments that moved from effect to the cause, or from the cause to the effect. A modern example of this is the maxim, where there's smoke, there's fire. A typical maxim moving from effect to cause. We could observe something of this at work in Hebrews as well, as we look more closely at Hebrews 7:12, or in chapter 8, verses 7 and 13. We find examples of arguing from the effect to the cause. One might also argue from the general to the specific, or the specific to the general. And also, one might argue from considerations of the contrary. We find examples of this in Hebrews 8:4 and 12:8. If Jesus were on earth, he would not be a priest at all. Unstated premise, he is a priest somewhere. Therefore, he must be a priest in heaven. One also can appeal to historical precedents as the basis for deductive proof. When we move to deliberative oratory in particular, we find the following topics to be commonly listed by rhetorical theorists, and in fact commonly used in real life or literary speeches. A major subheading of deliberative rhetoric is honor. Is the course of action being proposed the virtuous course? We would find an orator promoting a particular course to be arguing that it does in fact exhibit one or more key virtues embraced by the group. Very often these are spoken of in terms of the four cardinal virtues of Greco-Roman ethics: justice, courage, temperance or moderation, and prudence or wisdom. A second way at this is arguing that a particular course will lead to a praiseworthy remembrance. Also, topics of advantage are very important. Will this course of action enhance or advance our security, our safety? Will it lead to the continued enjoyment of existing goods or the acquisition of other goods? Will it prevent the loss of existing goods or avoid harm? Similarly, we might find other topics like the feasible, the lawful, or the necessary. Do we have the resources we need to pursue this course of action? Is this course of action in line with our laws, or in line with our sense of what is right? Is it a necessary course of action Typically, if it's not feasible, we have to ask, well, is it necessary, even if it's really, really difficult or costly? Topics of dissuasion would proceed from the opposite, namely showing that a course of action leads to the loss of advantage, the loss of honor, is impractical, and the like. The Sermon to the Hebrews employs deliberative topics extensively. And this is the subject of a section of my commentary, Perseverance and Gratitude. So I would simply, for your review of deliberative topics, refer you to pages 49 to 52 there in that book for material on how the author of Hebrews specifically appeals to the topics of what is just, courageous, honorable, expedient, conducive to security, and feasible, as he promotes the course of perseverance and argues against the course of defection from the Christian group. Judicial rhetoric is the major focus of ancient rhetorical theorists, but it is a far less prominent genre of oratory rhetoric in the New Testament. New Testament authors tend to be more concerned with directing communities, often in regard to specific challenges. Hence, we find deliberative rhetoric to be far more common, or deliberative topics to be far more often invoked in the New Testament than judicial topics. However, if one were to look at Paul's defense speeches in Acts, or the speech by the lawyer Tertullus against Paul in Acts, we would find some examples of true judicial rhetoric, in that these are speeches offered in the hope of gaining a verdict of guilty or not guilty in their circumstances. We also find judicial rhetoric used in 2 Corinthians 1 to 2 and chapter 7, although this is an informal use of judicial rhetoric. It's not a law court by any stretch, but Paul is in fact seeking a verdict on his past behavior from the Christian group, seeking to exonerate himself in regard to his change of travel plans that he had announced to them. A change of plans that, on the one hand, seemed to facilitate a very unpleasant situation in Corinth, and then when he didn't go back to Corinth on his way back from Macedonia, seemed to smack of just being bitter and petty. So Paul marshals what is in effect a judicial speech in defense of his actions, in the hope of reestablishing his relationship with the Corinthians, of sweeping aside all that might stand in the way of his credibility with them, since he is in effect suspected of informally speaking, crimes against the audience. He has done them wrong, some in Corinth would say. He uses in these sections topics of refutation, refuting charges that one would see in the law court. He uses oaths, he calls witnesses, and even documentary evidence as he tries to establish his innocence of wrongdoing. We don't find much in the way of judicial topics in Hebrews, and certainly no judicial rhetoric where the author is going for a verdict of guilty or not guilty. But we do find some judicial topics as the author moves into arguments appropriate to contract law, especially with a view to establishing the validity of a new contract and its supersession of a previous agreement. That is to say, what the author puts forward in regard to the New Covenant and the Old Covenant intersects with what one would hear in the law courts, where the issue has to do with contracts and which are valid, which supersede, and what have you. This material, however, ultimately serves non-judicial goals. The judicial end here, establishing the new covenant as superseding the old, is ancillary to a deliberative end, namely urging perseverance in this new covenant and continued loyalty to its terms and to the mediator of this new covenant. Epideictic topics, as we find them listed in these rhetorical handbooks, tend to pertain primarily to the funeral oration and how one would develop a eulogy for a particular individual. This is, however, easily applicable to wider circumstances. For example, how one would create a panegyric, a speech in praise of a living person, or in praise of a city, or in praise of a virtue. In regard to people, epideictic topics largely look to external advantages that a person has had, his or her lineage, education, the offices held, his or her physical excellences, and also his or her moral excellences, particularly as these are proven in action. Again, one can often find epideictic topics used as ancillary topics in a deliberative speech, for example, to augment the speaker's own ethos or to decrease the credibility of rival voices, where the negative side of epideictic is used, censure or vituperation, or to maximize the honorable behavior of an individual and thus provide motivations to respond to him or her in the way urged by the speaker. This latter certainly comes into play in the letter to the Hebrews with its effusive praise of the Son and dwelling on the Son's honor and virtue exhibited in action. Again, this is something that I've mapped out at some length and in detail already in the introduction to my commentary, Perseverance and Gratitude. So once again, I would refer you at this point to pages 52 to 54 for details on how the author is using topics typical in encomia or commemorative addresses, and how this bundle of topics serves deliberative goals within the overall strategy of the sermon to the Hebrews. And there I would refer you especially to pages 54 through 56. Now, we've been looking at information that comes to us from the classical rhetorical handbooks that were used largely as textbooks in advanced rhetorical training. But I'd mentioned in an earlier segment the importance also of the progymnasmata, the pre-gymnasium level training that students received in composition and argumentation. If we were to go to these progymnasmata, we would find already within them exercises that provided students with a chance to practice all the elements, or at least major elements, that they would use throughout their careers as they constructed speeches, either deliberative or judicial. And in these exercises we find, for example, this outline for a complete argument that formed the basis of a common kind of exercise, one that would be used in regards to several different kinds of propositions. For example, confirming a crea, confirming the truth of a saying by some wise or famous person, or confirming a maxim, or supporting a proposition that the speaker wished to argue. And that outline takes us through some basic deductive steps, adding a rationale in support of the thesis, adding a rationale that confirms the rationale that supports the thesis, consideration of the contrary, course of action, a consideration of the contrary. If this were not the case, this would be true, but since this isn't true, that must be the case. So some basic deductive strategies followed by some basic inductive strategies, arguments from historical example, from analogy, and appeals to maxims or citations of ancient authority. My article on how Greek was the author of Hebrews gives a great deal of attention to this exercise and to places in which this outline shows up in Hebrews, most notably in Hebrews 12, 5 to 11. So I would refer you to that reading for this module to dig into the pro-gymnastic training of the author of Hebrews, or at the very least the way in which pro-gymnastic exercises have left an imprint on his rational argumentation. Here is an example of how one might have worked out the textbook exercise, just to provide another set of examples that might help you think about these different elements of argumentation and therefore be able to identify them when they show up in a particular text. So the statement that we're taking up is the famous statement by Isocrates: "The root of education is bitter, but the fruit is sweet." And I attempt here to create, in effect, what the middle school student might have created, or the early high school student might have created in undertaking this exercise. Truer words were never spoken than those by Isocrates concerning the labors and rewards of formative discipline. The root of education is bitter, but the fruit is sweet. For study is indeed toilsome, straining the eyes, stealing time from more immediately pleasant pursuits, and stretching students beyond the areas of their comfort. Yet the experience of generation after generation is that, for fruit that satisfies more deeply and lasts far longer and rewards more richly, greater toil is required and fitting. If the fruits of such rigorous training were not ultimately rewarding, our very teachers, who endured such training to no end, would testify to the fact and would join us now in pursuits that yielded their fruits more quickly and with less toil. Yet our teachers are the most vocal to remind us that the labors they put us through, which they put themselves through again and again alongside us, yield abundant rewards through long, productive, and honored lives. It was because of his commitment to this toil that Demosthenes is celebrated across the world as the finest speaker ever to have lived. Throughout his youth, and even into his adulthood, he toiled long and hard to perfect his craft of public speaking, learning from difficult teachers who were more like taskmasters. But in the end, he won for himself the victor's wreath in Athens for his proficiency in public speaking. And who has not observed those foolish men who want a quick victory in an athletic event, rushing in and trying to compete without training, only to become the source of an easy victory for their disciplined and trained antagonists, in the end accomplishing nothing except helping another achieve honor? But the one who trains hard and long, enduring rigorous exercise and imposing a healthful diet, who turns down invitations to 100 parties in order to spend the time running around the deserted streets, is the one who enters the competition and gains a victory that will long be remembered and cherished. Thus, in every facet of life, the proverb holds true: as a person sows, so he or she will reap. Let us therefore commit ourselves to the toil of education, sowing vigorously while in seminary, so that in due course we may enjoy the lifelong fruits of the wisdom and skills that have been imparted to us by our teachers.